Welcome back. Now, South Africa's transition to democracy in 1994 marked an historic turning point in the country's history, ending decades of apartheid and ushering in an era of freedom and equality and, of course, hope. And 1994 was the year in which South Africans, irrespective of race, voted and elected the first black president of this country in Tata Nelson Mandela. Now, as South Africa commemorates 3 decades of democracy in 2024, we look at the legacy and at some of the milestones and what all of this has meant for us as South Africans. And joining us virtually right now to reflect on these 30 years of South African democracy, I'm joined by struggle veteran Cheryl Carolus. Ms Carolus, good morning. Welcome. So good to have you with us here on Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers.
So it's 3 decades since South Africa attained democracy, and the political landscape has changed. And everyone, of course, at the start, expected to enjoy their freedom as well as exercise their constitutionally enshrined rights, human rights, including practicing their culture without fear of repression and all the rest. But since 1994, in your personal reflection as an activist, how do you think we fared and how far have we come?
Sakina, I believe that we have come a very long way. And I know South Africans, we stress about this, we debate it, and so we should, because I think what we're realizing now is that democracy was not an event. It's not something that just happened on the 27th of April, 1994. And I think we labored under that impression for a long time. And so our measurement of the success of our achievement and how our democracy is faring has been variable. I think we've come a long way, and I often say, just this weekend, I was discussing with some of the youngsters in our family, and these are black kids from poor areas, and they were just completely astounded at what was the normal then, with pass laws, with raids in homes, with detentions, with torture, and even what they would have had access to as poor kids compared to what they take for granted. So I think it's come a long way. I think that we are, but I think we've had a few wake-up calls that I think we rested on our laurels. And as I say, we thought it was an event. And what we're realizing now is that there are human beings in charge of our democracy, not only in government, but in the corporate sector, in our schools, and some of the things that we see and observe in our daily life is of deep concern to us, as it should be. So I think that a good sobering call about the fact that democracy has to be nurtured, has to be developed, and has to be interrogated all the time and challenged when necessary.
And I'm glad, you mentioned that, because if we think back to something that the late Dr. Ali Mazrui, for example, said, when he said that as South Africa, what we got was the crown without the jewels, referring, of course, to the political freedom that we attained without the economic freedom. And today, we still hear young people say that settlement, the negotiated settlement of 94, was actually a sellout position. We hear that quite a lot from some young people. How do you, as someone who was there in paving that way to that settlement, was an activist in fighting for the freedom of this country, explain to young South Africans that that is not necessarily how the situation should be seen, because they believed they were sold out in terms of the settlement we got?
Sakina, I think that we need to also give young people a sense of agency and a sense of responsibility about shaping the democracy they want. So there's this, what's the saying, something to the effect that if you want to guarantee your freedom, you have to build it yourself, or something like that. And I think that that is something that perhaps we, as my generation, have not sufficiently communicated or entrusted younger people. I think it's wrong for people of my generation to keep hanging on to power as if we are the only people who can build the kind of future for our country that is desirable. And so as a consequence, I think young people haven't grown up with a sense of urgency and agency that my generation was so fully charged with. I think that we need to let go and we need to entrust. So that young people, sorry, let me stop there, Sakina.
I'm so sorry. I thought you had concluded that point, Ms Carolus, because I wanted to ask, do you think that at that turn of the situation in South Africa, when we did make that leap to democracy, do you think that the leaders at the time took the populace into its confidence sufficiently in terms of just explaining exactly what the situation was? In terms of that economic situation particularly, do you think that they could have told us more about what the realities were?
Sakina, I think the communication at the time was adequate and well understood, because South Africans signed up for the kind of transition that we had. Adults who were alive and thinking, and even younger people, know that at that stage, every corner of the streets in our townships had police with dogs, with barbed wire, tear gas, huge armored vehicles, rattles, I mean, all sorts of animals, they were called, these armored vehicles, that they shot live ammunition at young people and killed hundreds of people on a daily basis. So your average South African who were living in South Africa knew that, even white South Africans. And that was a big turning point that, in fact, got the ruling government, of the apartheid government of the day, to come to the table, was when even white South Africans started to believe that the situation was untenable. Their sons, young white men, were called up. It was compulsory to go and fight, and they were sent initially to the borders of our country to fight a war they didn't understand. And then they were sent into townships of South Africa, pointing guns and being expected to fire live ammunition at young people just like themselves. And white South African mothers in particular found common ground with black mothers, who in fact said that our children are dying for a war that we cannot morally understand or justify or see a way forward for the future of our children. And so people in South Africa were living in townships in particular, but as I said, even white South Africans started to realize that we were at war with ourselves. We were not, schools, universities were closed for long periods. Police ran onto universities and school campuses and shot and killed people. Hector Peterson, Ashley Kriel on the Cape Flats, the Vosloo-Rus, they were just everywhere. There were people being shot on a daily basis. There were armies inside our country. So South Africans understood that, firstly, we were not going to win through the battle of a gun. The National Party was not going to defeat our struggle, our yearning for freedom and our assertion of our rights through the battle of a gun. No matter how many people they killed, Black South Africans rose again and again. Every week we would bury people in every single township, 20 to 50 people. We would be spending half our week having funerals in our townships. And white South Africans also knew they were living in fear of their neighbors. They couldn't live the lives that they live today. And so for all of us, we understood that things had to change. And yes, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can all say, maybe we could have done this better, maybe we could have done that better. Well, I think that the one thing that we also all bought into the time, which is why we went to vote. And this is where I think the disappointment comes in, the justifiable disappointment, Sakina. If we look at some of the wrongdoing that has happened in the name of democracy, it's not democracy. State capture, the stealing of money, the dying of children in our schools, in pit latrines, the lack of the hunger that children have is just unacceptable. And that's not democracy, and that is what we should fight. Not a debate about whether what we did in 94 was correct or not. As I said, I'm sure there are learnings that all of us have from then. Did we have to shift out of that apartheid terrorist state? Yes, without a doubt. What we've done with it and what the people we elected and entrusted with our vote has done with it, some of them have done completely criminal acts. And we should deal with them, and that's where our focus must be. Not having debates. We are where we are. So what are we going to do about it?
But to be fair, Ms Carolus, I am, for me, one of my truisms is if you don't know your history, if you don't know where you come from, you are bound to regress. And as such, I think what young people are asking for, and what some of us are also asking for, is for some of the details that perhaps we were not privy to at a certain stage in our transition to democracy, because it still informs where we are today. If you look at South Africa today, we are the most unequal society in the world. Where does that stem from? It stems from a redress from past imbalances that perhaps was not effected. And hence I ask, so let me ask it more pointedly. When this transition happened in 1994, what was the economic situation in the country and what was in the coffers of the state? What did this democratic South Africa inherit from apartheid South Africa? Because when people think about redress and the imbalance that we find and found, what did you have to work with at the very beginning?
Sakina, I'm not sure I'm getting all of what you say, but let me try, and then you can perhaps ask me if you want me to elaborate further. The inequality in South Africa was, in fact, way greater than what it is now. It was hidden and obfuscated by the fact that you and I were not regarded as citizens in our country. So the measurement of welfare and wealth was in fact purely on the basis of 17% of the population, which was classified as whites, and therefore the only people who were, in terms of the apartheid regime, were considered to be proper South Africans. My family was classified as all sorts of people. Some Xhosas who were supposed to be in the Transkei, in their homeland. Even though they were born in Cape Town, they were in Gugulethu, they were considered to be Xhosa citizens who now had no right to be in the city of Cape Town and had to go back to the Transkei. And others in my family were registered as coloured in the Population Registration Act, and others were registered as other coloureds. I mean, all kinds of things. But we were not citizens, so inequality was not measured in those ways. But if you look at what we had, what we didn't have, anybody who was not a white child, your parents had to pay for all your stationery at school, your textbooks, every pencil, and the things you were entitled to be paid. There was no minimum wage, there was no protection. And so inequality then was measured only in terms of, and poverty was only measured in terms of white people. Poverty was now outsourced to these Bantustans and to colored and Indian group areas. So are we better off today than what we were then? Without a doubt. Today we assert as a right under our constitution, our right to housing, our right to dignity, our right to electricity, our right to freedom from hunger, our right to land. Whether we have that is another matter. My view on that is this is what we have to continue to fight for. As I say, it wasn't an event that was going to happen on the 27th of April. And all of us, myself included, I think we maybe thought it was all just going to, abracadabra on the 27th. What we're now realizing, we have to fight for this every step of our life. And perhaps it's the wrongdoings in the rest of the world where they have much more mature democracy. Look at the stuff in the United States today. You look at some of the stuff that Donald Trump is spewing. You look at some of the stuff that Rishi Sunak got up to in the United Kingdom. Those things just wouldn't happen in our country. It can't. We would be in court immediately and stop them from perpetrating those things. Shipping people out to Rwanda, really? I mean, because they happen to be black or brown-skinned. So I think that we have to accept as South Africans also we must look at the world and see our place in the world. And I think that, yes, the levels of poverty is unforgivable. And here I want to address myself particularly to the haves in our country. And also an acceptance that most people who fall within that category, and particularly most people who are wealthy in South Africa, your wealth is still determined by the color of your skin. And it really, I'm never sure whether it makes me sad or hopping mad, that when people, and particularly I'm going to call it out, when white South Africans say, can't you black people just move on? It's very hard to move on when you've got no food in your stomach, or when you're a mother and you know the hunger pangs that your children are having, and that same mother is in your kitchen every morning to prepare food for you and your children to go to school, and your child is sitting at home hungry. And so I think that insight from us as South Africans need to be addressed. The pattern of the overlay of inequality between race and inequality in our country must be addressed. Yeah. And I think we skirt around those issues in our non-racialism that we stand for and that we protected for in terms of our constitution. And then those who are wealthy in South Africa really have to understand that in the rest of the world, the levels of wealth that is in the hands of so few is unacceptable and in fact would never be allowed in the law. And so I do think we need to have very serious rethinks about these matters that make young, hungry kids who die of poverty in our country question democracy. For those of us who play rugby, we're in the Olympics again, all kinds of things. And maybe we need to have a hard look at ourselves if we want to question whether we have a sustainable democracy. Those of us who have and are comfortable in our middle class and wealthy homes.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I could listen to this and engage for so much longer, but that's where we have to leave it for this morning. A struggle veteran, Cheryl Carolus, thank you so much for your time this morning as we continue to reflect here on SABC and Morning Live on South Africa's 30 years of democracy.